This week, we talk to Gradon, Fisher & Paykel Healthcare CEO. As New Zealand's most valuable listed company with a current market capitalisation of $15 billion, it expects full-year operating revenue for the 2023 financial year to be within the range of around $1.55 to $1.6 billion. During the pandemic, Fisher & Paykel Healthcare's respiratory products played an important role in helping patients with obstructive sleep apnea or requiring at-home respiratory support. The company managed to maintain supply despite the challenges. Lewis talks about Fisher & Paykel Healthcare's performance post-COVID and shares his personal reflection as CEO, having worked for the same company for 40 years. This is the Monday Call, brought to you by NZ Funds.
First, I'd love to talk about you and that 40-year career. How did you get there? How did you get in the front door of Fisher & Paykel, and then that journey that you went through, especially around the R&D and the design part of the business, which is really the thing that's so special about Fisher & Paykel. It would be great to hear your journey of how you ended up becoming CEO.
Okay,
so how long have you got?
Yeah, when I look at your whole agenda, I don't know how we're going to do all of that in an hour, but we'll try, shall we? So look, when I graduated from university, my burning desire was to design something that would be used. That's what I wanted to do. That was a limited number of companies in New Zealand. And when I look back, probably the lucky part was that the job I took was at Fisher & Paykel, and that's why I took it, because it was an opportunity to design things. It wasn't the most lucrative thing I could have done at the time, but it was, what I wanted to do. So I started in R&D, and I guess the context here now is, when I started in 1983, we were about 20 people in the office, about 20 people in manufacturing. And today that's close to 6,500 total. So you're part of a growing business. And I think this goes to when the scope is improving care and outcomes with medical devices, there's an awful lot that humanity has yet to do. So you've got, a fabulous scope and a global scope, and I think that's kind of, a key part of the story. So as the business grew, I kind of progressed through, when you're 20 people, you're doing a little bit of everything, aren't you? And I think that's been a fabulous part of my career. I've sold, I've been in manufacturing, I've been in a regulatory space, I've been part of a lot of what we do through that journey.
And when you think about, I guess, delving into the R&D side of things, I guess this is getting into the crux of the business immediately, but it's also your experience and where you've come from in that journey. But at the R&D pipelines, it's not just come up with some sort of design or idea and build it and sell it in 3 months. This is a long, long process. But yet the end market moves quite fast, and we saw it with different things that have happened with say vaccines and COVID or respiratory and COVID, but the things that you were delivering quickly during that time, for example, weren't just designed in the 3 months prior. They were designed over years and years. How do you decide as a business, or first as a designer, when you're in? People talk about what was the best job, and you probably have to say it's being the CEO, but you probably are going to say when you're a 23-year-old designer in the R&D department.
Yeah, had a ball. Look, really complex question, and I think there's a little bit of maybe relevant history there. If you go back to Fisher & Paykel's origins in appliances, it started off importing product, and New Zealand was heavily tariff protected. They were smart enough to know that tariffs weren't going to last forever. And we're going back 40s, 50s, 60s, and we were going to have to manufacture in New Zealand. And then the next step was, you can't manufacture appliances in New Zealand and compete with GE on a global stage, or even in New Zealand. You can't compete with those companies. So the next step in the thinking is you're going to have to do something different. And ideally, you want to do everything different and you want to do everything better, because you're not going to compete head to head with these massive European American companies. So when I started in R&D, it was fully built into the culture that you have to do something different. We're talking about early 80s. Innovation was the catchphrase at Fisher & Paykel. And of course, every company on the planet today would say we're innovators. It was quite unusual, or a lot more unusual prior to the 80s. We need to innovate to be competitive. We're going to have to do something different. We're going to have to do something better. And then when it got to the healthcare business, translating something different, something better, that became you're going to have to improve outcome. So the core of our philosophy and the core of what we do is how do we improve outcomes? And that can be a holistic thought in our business. They can be different. We can have a patient, we can have someone using our product, we can have someone paying for our product, and they can all be different entities. So something better for all those entities is what we're aiming at. So the discipline in the R&D process, and this is just like everything we do, the process continually improves over the years. But these days, the discipline is what's the patient, what's the condition, what can we do to improve outcomes, across those three domains. And then once you're stuck on, or committed, it's a better word, once you're committed to improving outcomes, you know what you're aiming at, and you know what you can try and do. And I think that's a really, really core part of the philosophy. So then it's, and our world's become more and more complex, I think rightly so, over the years, in medical devices, more and more regulated, which I think is correct. Then it's about, and this is some of the exciting things. You're doing clinical research, you're doing technology research. Sometimes the idea is quite simple, but you can't make it, you can't manufacture it. Sometimes you can manufacture it, but not cost effectively. So then you're into manufacturing. Now you've got a different way of treating patients, or a variation on a way of treating patients. So we're trying to communicate that this is a better way of doing it to physicians globally. There's a time frame, there's clinical data, you can call it marketing. It's a very, very specialised kind of marketing. And generally, the way to do it, the way we do it, is with salespeople calling on hospitals, talking to doctors, going through clinical data, going through what our therapy might do and what clinical data shows it does. And then you're asking a hospital to change their clinical practice. You used to treat these patients like this. There's really good clinical data to say if you treat them like that, you're going to get better outcomes across all these domains. And now add all that up, that's quite a time frame, isn't it? I've gone from clinical research, technology research, manufacturing research, and clinical research to show the outcome improvement of the patient. And then actually, the way it actually works is calling on doctors, hospitals, physicians one by one, and going through it with them. Quite a long time frame. So I think that's another really, really core element of our business. What our business is built on does take a long time. So you must think over the long term, and you must act over the long term. And at times that takes courage. And when I say long term, we would call 5 years short term. And when I say long term, I'm talking 30. And you made one comment about the CEO role. One of the first investor conferences I did, I was talking about long term, short term. I got to about lunchtime, and by then I've spoken to half a dozen people, and I realised that this was in California. I realised that my audience, short term's a quarter, long term's a year. So I had to change my language real fast. But anyway, I think the key element is, this does take a long time. And it's not because we're slow. It's not because things aren't moving quickly. That is the nature of the beast, and it's challenging.
It's a really fascinating process, because how do you, and because you've done all these different roles in the business, you'll have firsthand experience, obviously, but you want to develop a new product or device or whatever it is, and then and that needs to have quite a lot of research and development and prototypes and all that sort of thing before you even speak to the doctors. And then you have to rely upon the fact that the doctors and hospitals take up that product. And that's hard in itself, because you might have a doctor that might be skeptical, but also, and this is from this is a rudimentary comment, but it seems from the outside in, when you work and deal with a hospital, it is incredibly difficult to speak to the right people who are making the purchase decisions in hospitals in California, and what's the budget and who's making the decision and when is it going to be decided upon. How do you balance wanting to be advancing this technology and taking it to market, but not going too fast, because you might get tripped up at the last minute by the people who are actually buying this stuff?
Yeah, so as I say, our process continually improves over the years. I'd say the way we think about it today is...
And obviously you've done it before.
We have. And we get better and better at it over time. And you can see that in kind of all of our numbers. If you look at them over a 20-year time frame, there's actually continuous improvement in our productivity, so to speak. But the way we think about it now is, if it's a new therapy, we really want to understand the mechanisms of action. What's this therapy doing? And that'll be clinical work, and that'll be locked down. So this is what it's doing. And you can be confident about that. This nasal high flow would be a classic example. We know it improves CO2 washout. That's a mechanism of action. We know it humidifies mucocilia to, body temperature saturated. We know it does those two things. We know it does a pressure. And so that's kind of science. We know that. That's a mechanism of action. Then the next step is, does that have a physiological outcome? That's what it's doing. Can I measure something good in the physiology? Can I measure better oxygen in the blood? Can I measure a lower work of breathing? So these are things we can now move on and we can measure, and we can say, yep, I've got some physiological improvements. And that's all doable with a high level confidence. And then the next step is to move on and say, does this result in a better outcome for the patient? And that's the large studies, randomized controlled trials, that's the grind. And that's what can take time. That's where you can get some twists and turns in the road. And often that's about how you design the studies, how you're applying the therapy. But that can be quite a long time frame. But if you look at it over, a 10 to 20 year time frame, eventually, with some twists and turns in the road, that will turn into a clinical practice guideline, and it might come from European Respiratory Society or the World Health Organization or American Society. That'll turn into a clinical practice guideline. And then at that point in time, think of that as like advice for physicians. There's still another step to actually change the practice. And then overlaying all this, we kind of think of physicians, hospitals as there's an adoption curve. You've got early adopters. Oh, I see what it's doing. It's washing out CO2. That's going to give you great outcomes. Eventually, there's an early adopter. And then you've got kind of a bell. We think of it as a bell curve. It's an abstract concept. And then at the other end of this bell curve, you've got your late adopter, which is one of the clinical practice guidelines. What's Auckland Hospital doing? What's Middlemore Hospital doing? Okay, I might change. So that's kind of the general progress. Now, hospitals, healthcare systems, really, at the end of the day, how to treat a patient, the responsibility is the prescribing physician, and he will make his decision for, what they're going to do, how they're going to treat that patient. It does reside there. But in terms of changing clinical practice, in my selling experience, hospitals are very complex, healthcare systems are very complex beasts. And you can generally find 20 or 30 different people or departments or parts of the healthcare system that are empowered to say, no, we're not doing that. But you generally can't find one point of call is empowered to say, yes, we can do that. So now we're just down to the mechanism of changing clinical practice. That also has a time lag because grossly generalising, you kind of need to get a bit of a consensus across doctors, nurses, procurement, infection control, management, technicians, servicing. So it goes. And even within those groups, you're trying to get a consensus within each grouping.
I've never thought about it like this, but so I could be totally off track. I'll put that provisor in before I ask you this. But is the reason that, I mean, we're a small country in the bottom of the South Pacific, but is part of the reason why it's so successful, other than things like the philosophy that you talk about, but is that because you can get buy-in from, say, New Zealand, potentially Australia first, and get that consensus to then launch it more globally? And so the route to market is, in New Zealand, and I don't want to be too colloquial, but, you can kind of ring up someone at they're no longer DHBs, but at the DHB and go, hey, we've got this. And they go, okay, we'll come out for a coffee and we can talk about it. That's a little bit more difficult in the US, but you can kind of start creeping up the consensus. Or is that kind of an irrelevant way of how it's worked out over the last sort of 40 or 80 years?
No, I think you are getting to something that we do think is one of our competitive advantages of being in New Zealand. One is the whole idea you're going to have to do something different. It's not just the product, it's how you run your business. I mean, that originates from fundamentally from being in a small country trying to compete globally. So, that is definitely a big part of it. Then the other part is, there's a whole stage here. We talked about it, once we've got our product right, we have to work out what resonates with our audience. We have to work out how do we sell it. And we can do that in New Zealand and at least and in Australia for the last couple of decades. We were a household name. There's huge trust and confidence. We can go in and work out what clinical data is more important to these physicians, which we can work out how to make the change here. And there's enough trust and confidence in healthcare systems in New Zealand and Australia, where if we get it completely wrong, we can iterate it and get it right. So for most things we do, this is another kind of unintended benefit. When we first introduce a new product, we might only have parts of a manufacturing line. Some of it might be manual. We might only have one set of tooling, things like that. We can make it, but we can't make a whole lot. Now, we can possibly supply the New Zealand market or the Australian market whilst we're building up our manufacturing capacity. So that does allow us to launch new products, I would say, sooner rather than later. I've heard the odd interpretation, man, you take a long time to roll out. It's not we take a long time to roll out, it's that we start sooner because we've got these lower volume markets that we can get going with when we have low manufacturing output. And then, as I say, the second part is you can do focus groups, you can do all kinds of like marketing constructs, but the experience is actually trying to part people from their money is quite different to the focus group. So we like to work out, well, we have to work out our selling message. And once we think we've got it right, once we think, yeah, this is what people are relating to, or in the early part of the process, we might come across, well, here's the problem. They're all worried about this, and I don't have that data yet. I really want that data before I go somewhere else. I'm not going to make any progress selling till I have that study finished, So we'll get I would generalise as our product launch. It is the manufacturing, and it is I'm going to call it the selling process, the selling approach. We'll get that right in New Zealand and Australia. Once we think we've got it right, we'll roll it out around the world. And I think part of the reason we can do that is we are such a trusted name here. When we get it wrong, I mean, you probably wouldn't do this if you got it right every time, first time. There's always improvements. So when we get it wrong in this market, we're forgiven.
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating because
Or plus,
you do.
plus when we say, here, I've got a new product, large part of this month, I've got a new product I want you to have a look at,
People will look at
we're
it.
good to go. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that when you think about Fisher and Paykel Healthcare versus the global market, you do think, well, how does it possibly compete on the global scale, and what are the differentiators? And you've perfectly described that process of getting a product to market, and the trusted brand here means it's a fantastic launch pad that perhaps the company wouldn't be as successful if it was sort of uplifted and taken somewhere else, which is kind of a question I want to ask you. Not bear with me, but we were talking about before we went live that since 1967, or when the sort of the Fisher and Paykel entity listed, to today, the if you had invested $1, it'd be now $12,000, and then if you invested $1 in Fisher and Paykel Healthcare when it listed in 2001, it would now be $3,000. Now that is phenomenal. That is what you call long-term investing, and we were also joking about this obsession with quarterly earnings, where if you just look at the philosophy and principles and track record of a company like Fisher and Paykel Healthcare, you need to think long term, and like you say, long term's not even 5 years for a business like this; it's 30 years. And imagine if you'd put $100 of your kids' money in Fisher and Paykel Healthcare in 2001, and 23, 22 years later, they've probably got their college paid for. So it's, how do you keep the company in New Zealand? Because as an investor, we are an investment business, and we love investing in great companies, and we're not after a short-term boost because of M&A. We are after 3,000% in 20 years. That is our bread and butter. And any M&A, we think, especially in the New Zealand market, which is small to begin with, is not what we want as shareholders. We want to be on the journey for the next 30 years. How do you keep the business from being a large company's sort of a vanity project or M&A list and taken away, and because it also could sort of, I guess, ruin the success of it because of what we were just talking about?
Yeah, I think there are two components to your question. There's the how do you keep it in New Zealand, and how do you deal or think about M&A. So remind me, there's two parts, because
that's why I've got a pen. I'll write it down.
I think first up, as custodians of the business, we need to do what's right for the business. And then the way I would think of that is there are some huge advantages to being locating some of our activities in New Zealand. I mean, if you look at it today, out of 6,500 people, maybe 3,500 will be in New Zealand, 3,000 outside New Zealand. So, we are an international business. We've got people in 54 countries. So I would think of us as an international business, and we have some functions located in New Zealand. And that trend is going to continue, of New Zealand being a smaller and smaller proportion, certainly, of our people. So when we think about what's in New Zealand and what makes sense, we're looking at what's the advantages and what's the disadvantages, because there are some disadvantages to being in New Zealand. But we make that as I would say, what's best for the business decision. And then just to kind of back that up, and we've talked about some of the advantages of being in New Zealand. So I'd say we're making the right decision for the business there, and we're taking advantage of what New Zealand can offer, and we're mitigating the disadvantages, which are all related to distance. And then I just want to back that up a little bit with a comment that, and then we also think, in terms of social responsibility, our responsibilities are probably proportional to, where we have the impact. So in terms of social responsibilities, we have a big impact in New Zealand. We don't have much of an impact in Los Angeles or Paris or London. So just park that comment. Now, when it goes to M&A, the way we would think about that is our job is to run the business as well as we possibly can, and we would drill that right down to improving care and outcomes. If we're doing something better for patients, better for healthcare systems, let's focus on that. And this also goes to how do you get stuck on the long term, how do you not get dragged to short term. Let's do what's best for the patient. Let's do what's best for healthcare systems. Let's be focused on it. Let's make sure everything we do is pointed at that. And that's in the conviction that, well, if that's what you're doing, you're going to have a pretty good business. A good business model will follow because you're getting better outcomes for patients and healthcare. So the good business model follows. And then the next part, and I hope we're doing it here today, is if we can communicate our business very, very well, it should be valued in the right place. And if you're valued in the right place, I guess the market does what the market does as far as M&A goes. But I think our job is to run the business as well as possible, and then to try and communicate it to the wider audience as well as possible, and the rest follows.
And to get the full value wherever it's based, which is at the moment, and hopefully for a good long time yet,
that's right.
The New Zealand market. Related to that, Lewis, I had a really interesting trip to China and Hong Kong recently. And one of the fascinating things about that share market is, now someone listening will probably say my stats are wrong, but this is what I heard anyway. Of the 18,000 listed companies, 70% of them are founder run, where the founder and the management team was sort of there from the beginning, or close to, and have a sort of that, not just shareholding, but that personal relationship with the business. And that's how we would consider you as the CEO of Fisher & Paykel Healthcare. You've been 40 years, as you may as well have been there at the beginning, at least for the healthcare business, and for a good chunk of the combined entity when it was part of the appliances business. Without sort of, I'm not asking you to tell me what your journey in the future is of when you're going to, but is that something that gives you, in the end, people retire and move on, and you've got the tenure at your business is incredible across the business, but that will slowly transition, management teams slowly transition to management teams rather than founders. And do you think, how do you think about culture in that sense? Because I guess NZ Funds are similar. We've had the tenure at our firm is sort of we're over 30 years old, and there are a lot of people, including people in the management team and on the board, that have been there since the start. But how do you think about that transition in culture?
Look, it doesn't bother me so much. I mean, culture is one of the hardest things I ever have to talk to, and it's one of the most important. But as an entity, Fisher & Paykel Healthcare, I mean, we've been going over 50 years. We've got a strong entrenched culture. We reinforce our culture, and I'd kind of go back to, it's just, and you've got long tenure is really important to a successful culture, I think, as well. But if you go back to when I started, I was part of a group of 40, and that was divided into, 4 or 5 groups of 8 or 9 or 10 people, and that had a manager, and that reported to someone, and that reported to someone, and that reported to someone. The culture's intact. The transference of the culture, the leadership, the demonstration of the culture is intact. You've still got the same relationships, just on a bigger scale. I think it's quite scalable. If you think of maybe a very simple mental model is every person has 10 people reporting to them, and then it's just how big do you want to build your pyramid. it's quite a scalable model.
How do you think about it in terms of culture? Is you can't just go, right, our culture is going to be X, and everybody, it kind of comes from the people that you hire and the type of people who run the business, and it sort of trickles down, I guess. What do you think about it explicitly, or is it just how do you manage culture at a business with 7,000 people and half of them, or I forget the numbers, are overseas?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
A lot of travel.
There is that. We bring a lot of people here, absolutely. We're trying to be. I think we crossed a. I don't know where to start with this question. I think the one interesting thing, whenever it was about a decade ago, we sat down and we thought, well, we want to lock in some principles of this culture. And it was about the internationalism. We were at one stage bothered by, I'm not getting the fish and paykel culture in this country. I'm not getting the fish and paykel culture in that country. So we did a couple of things to try and to fix that. It's well and truly fixed now. But a couple of things to fix it were, let's try and write it down. Now, we didn't sit down and go, what culture do we want? Let's write it down.
That's what Enron did, and they wrote it on their door, and look what happened to them.
We said, what do we do? What do we do? And how do I describe it? So that was our process. And then the second part with regard to the international component was the realization that I don't want to pick on any country, but if you're in France, you might be thinking that's a New Zealand culture. Here in France, we do it differently. We don't do that in France. We do it this way. Here in the US, we don't do that. That's New Zealand, and that's a very small country. We do it differently in the US. We'll do it the US way. And the realization was to make it abundantly clear, this is not a New Zealand culture, this is Fisher and Paykel's culture. And then the only intricacy really becomes, and you might need a local variation to that, but we've tried to be really clear over the last few decades, this is the core Fisher and Paykel culture. And separating it from that's a New Zealand culture is pretty much what cracked it for us internationally. Then, the other thing, I think, in terms of maintaining a culture and what's the culture and getting consistency, you really are just getting down to its tenure and how you behave.
It's always something that can improve, I guess, or not improve, but develop and
develop. Yeah, absolutely.
But it's one of the, I guess, difficulties and one even, like you say, harder to manage as the company grows in people, but also grows in cultures around, globally.
It's always grown in people. I guess the point I was making very poorly a little while ago is it's kind of the same. If you go from 20 people to 30, that is just, it's completely scalable. What did I say, 20 to 30? To go from 1,000 to 1,500, it's just the same thing, exactly the same thing is happening, but 50 times. If I got my maths right.
Let's take a step change from the business and talk about the industry, because, I mean, I don't want to dwell too much on COVID specifically, but it was a horrible time for obviously the entire global population. But it was an incredibly unique period of time for Fisher and Paykel Healthcare, because you were working within your products so happened to be the ones that were really sought after in a respiratory pandemic. Has that changed how you see your product development and what you're looking at? And how's the whole healthcare system changed because of it? And has it?
Gee, wonderfully complex question. I think if you take probably it's had all sorts, we could talk about this all day, but I think the fundamental for our business is one of the newer therapies let's say, in terms of patients that could treat before COVID, patients that was treating before COVID, less than 10% penetration, because it's a change in clinical practice. So we're only 10%, less than 10% of the way through making that change. That's after 10 to 15 years. So what COVID did for us is it took this therapy and it put it front and centre of practically every respiratory physician in the world. So in that sense, it totally accelerated knowledge of the therapy. Vast majority of physicians, respiratory physicians around the world would have used this therapy. I'm referring to nasal high flow or optiflow therapy during COVID. Before COVID, we're less than 10% penetrated, so they've all seen it in use on COVID patients. So I think that's the biggest kind of fundamental long-term change to business. The implications are got a lot more clinicians familiar with the therapy. They've bought some equipment and their first thought is that that's to treat COVID patients. So that gives the business a big opportunity to accelerate growth. Haven't really got any hard runs on the board to put numbers on it on a quarterly basis or an annual basis whatsoever. But the fundamental is we were less than 10% penetrated. Now we don't have a single physician who doesn't know what it is, what it does, and probably has treated patients with it. So we're kind of ahead of where we would have been, and that's great news. And fundamentally, we must be ahead. So that's great news. But then the other flow-on effect, and one of the short-term challenges is executing on that and demonstrating to the 6-monthly, 12-monthly thinkers that it's happening. That's a real challenge. But put that aside, the other implication is things that we were planning for the future on these 10, 20, 30 years journey to maintain our growth rate, they have to come up a bit sooner. Assuming we've accelerated this one, we'd like to bring other things forward as well. And I'm really glad with where you started this conversation, because now you're trying to you can see the complexity of bringing these things forward. And we're not talking about, I'll get that in 6 months instead of 12. We're talking, that was a 10 or 15 year journey. I want to bring it forward a year or two in any way I possibly can. And we started thinking like that actually during FY 21-22. One of the implications here is we need to bring other things forward.
And is that because you need to, as a business, take advantage of the fact that your products that exist now are front in mind of physicians because they've all seen it and used it, and showcasing what other benefits they can have other than just treating a COVID patient?
Yes, we need to do that. But the fundamental thinking when we think about the business is we've kind of got, it's pretty high growth, as you pointed out. And the way to get the high growth is we've got to have something that's in its early days. We've got to have something that's kind of partway through, because when we're successful, we have some things that are getting closer. If you look at where we started, the first thing Fisher & Paykel Healthcare ever did, we treat 70 to 80% of the world's patients that get invasive ventilation. So that's a lower growth. And to aggregate up to the high growth numbers we expect, you need to have something that's under 10% penetrated that's growing really, really strongly. So, there's just the law of large numbers. You can't grow at 10 or 15 or 20% in one place forever, in one thing. You can't do it forever. So our mental model is we're layering in things, we're laying in therapies that are at different stages of their evolution. I've forgotten your question. But so what we're trying to do is this one that was layered in and was quite a big growth driver prior to COVID, probably a very healthy growth driver in this post-COVID era because of what we talked about. That goes really well. We kind of want to pull some of the other layers forward a bit. I've forgotten the question.
No, that does, because I guess that's the point, is you've got this beachhead now. That beachhead isn't going to grow, like you say, because it already has, kind of thing. But it's also given an opportunity now that there's, and I could be getting the things wrong that make it make the sale easier, but there's brand recognition, there's the fact that the actual therapy recognition, and so it sort of pulls a whole lot of other things forward, and it does. It just takes time, and I guess in a competitive environment that you are in with some pretty worthy large competitors, they all see it too, and so it's kind of I guess the race is on somewhat to be taking advantage of this better, I guess, clarity of around what your products do, but also you want to be different as well and start a new sort of range of therapies because you standing start and you get a full market growth as well. Is that kind of how you think about it? So it's sort of like
what an outcome that we wouldn't like is you get this boost in revenue, you get this boost in uptake because of COVID, and all you've done is borrow that from the future. We want to build on that boost.
Yep. That's a great way of looking at it. So, speaking of competitors, and look, I don't know how much you can talk about these sorts of things, but it seems everybody's suing everybody for patents, and that is it an industry where people will literally see some of your products and copy it, or is it because there's some good R&D happening in unison and there's crossover because you're all working on the same thing? And how do you stop that happening? Because I guess the reason for the question is, again, thinking about the growth in China and the amazing amount of technology and education that's going into that country. There's going to be manufacturing, sort of, instead of just being the manufacturer, the actual design and the thinking is going to come from there too. How do you protect everything that you're doing?
Yeah. Numerous mechanisms.
And a lot and lawyers are in the end are the winners of these mechanisms, I'm guessing.
Well, it doesn't matter what happens, lawyers get paid. So that's not a bad business model. But anyway, numerous mechanisms. So the fundamental is we want to have whichever stage of evolution we're in, we want to have a product no one else has. So that means you need to keep running. And you need to keep improving your product. So that's absolutely fundamental. And I'll go back to another fundamental is, we're aiming at gross margins of 65%. So, you're selling something for nearly 3 times what it costs you to make it. And that difference has got to be driven by intellectual property. That's what people are paying for. That's how you can maintain these gross margins. So you've got a different product. The instinct, and people can potentially copy it, and the protection against the copying is patents. But I think the fundamental one, so if you have the patents in place, people can now copy things where patents have expired. Right? So if you think a patent has a 15 to 20 year lifespan, that means you've got to be, by the time they've copied something because patents have expired, we want a product that gives a better outcome, because the copying model will generally be relying on pricing because they're not spending the money on the R&D and the changing clinical practice and the clinical research. They're just spending the money on the D out of R&D. So they have a lower cost base, so potentially they're selling on price, and by the time that happens, the business model that we work with anyway is, we need something better than that.
You've moved on already to the next thing.
Absolutely. So I think, yes, patents. There's always a bit of patent activity going on in our business. It's generally in the background, and we've seen it bubble to the surface. I think, once around that 2014, 15 litigation. We just have to see that as a cost of doing business, the cost of maintaining, gross margins and competitive advantage. But I have to say, for our business anyway, there's always a little bit of something bubbling along.
This is not to give away what's in the hopper for your competitors, but what are you excited about looking forward from a product point of view? Is there things coming through that that are already announced? Perhaps let's not go back to the initial stages of some of your R&D, but are we going to see big changes in what you do and the products you're releasing, or is it all? I'm trying to say, I guess, from you're not a pharmaceutical company, but they talk about these blockbusters, or is the device business all about incremental improvements?
So this question is like being asked to choose your favourite child. So we're not going there. We're not going there. I think you've got your incremental improvements, and I described it. Once you're doing something, you need to keep moving it because copiers will follow. So we certainly have that part of the business, and that can be quite exciting. The ones, let's not say maybe more excited by, but the ones I tend to focus on are the ones that are driving a change in clinical practice, because these are the ones that the customers aren't actually asking for. So, one of the things about our business, or we're just going through it now, when we do an annual business plan, we have, my arms aren't long enough, we have a list of things we want to do this long. And we look at how much we could reasonably grow our costs by, and it's never big enough to do everything. And that's been the story of the business forever, and I think that's really, really good, really healthy. In fact, I think the day we don't have a list longer than what we can do, that's the day we're in trouble. So part of our planning process, is what are we going to do out of that list? And when it's something customers are asking for or need or want, or it's a clear improvement, that's really easy to say, oh, we should be doing that. The ones where it requires a bit of discipline is where it's a change in clinical practice that no one's actually asking for yet. That's the one you need the discipline to say, well, no, I'm doing that because we're going to get much better outcomes. And that's also the more, that's the innovation. That's the fundamental that the business is built on. But probably quite conscious of this because we're going through it right now. But the discipline is to do what the customers aren't currently asking for.
If I was to ask you a question about you and then related to what you've just said, when you think about what's your biggest stress as the CEO, would that be along the lines of one of the more, because in the end, someone has to make the decision about which one to go for, and it might not work out, or does it not quite work out like that? It's a bit more diversified, perhaps, but maybe your biggest stress is something else. But when you are the CEO of the biggest listed company in New Zealand, you've got some weight on your shoulders. How what are the things that keep you up at night?
These are so multi-layered questions. I think
when I said I'm not prepared, it's because there's this. They just keep flowing because there's so many things to ask you. But you can say I'm not going to answer that if you want. But it feels like a counselling session.
We're going to go all over the place with the answer, but I think that's in response to the question. I think
I'm not a journalist, I'm an investor. This is probably part of the issue.
Consistently I get asked questions kind of like that, and CEO this and CEO that. And I can't speak for any other company, but it kind of doesn't work like that in Fisher & Paykel. I would say that it's more of a team effort, it's more of a group effort. I do think... I don't feel much different. There's a few things, we can get to that. I don't feel much different in this role to any other role that I've had in the company in terms of the decision-making process. I had just as much input in my previous roles as I do in this one. So that's kind of how it works here. Just to that comment, you have to make the decision. Well, I don't actually. It's exactly the same process that I've worked with. Actually.
The process makes the decision rather than the individual.
For 30 years, it's the same process. I don't feel like there's much different. And I don't want to have this mental model. You've got to make a really tough decision. What is it, CEO? That's not how it works at all. It's more process driven. Then when you go to, I'll try and deal with your stress question. So I'll give you absolutely. Well, one, I probably wouldn't call it stress. In the clinical definition of the word, I don't really feel that. I feel a responsibility. And one of the things I guess that's unique about this role is, in New Zealand it's pretty low key, is the profile. I mean, you said it, you're the CEO, is the profile. And plenty of times we have something and I say, well, you need to talk to that guy, he knows all, he's the expert. And they go, no, I want to hear it from the CEO. So I think that's a unique obligation, and that is about presenting the business. And I guess my biggest stress, or the thing that bothers me the most, because it's the thing I'm responsible for, is presenting the business when it has to come from the CEO. I'm always worried I might not do a very good, not always, my biggest worry is I might not do a very good job of it. I haven't really had a career in PR, have I? But then for me, the mitigator, because at the end of the day, to do your job well, you need to sleep well, and sleep well, you can't be too stressed. So at the end of the day, I manage that by saying, there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever we are doing the right thing. That is what we do. We will do the right thing when it's unpopular. We will do the right thing when we cop flack. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind we'll do the right thing. So surely sooner or later I should be able to communicate that.
We were speaking on this podcast to Teresa Gatting a week or so ago, and she said something very similar, and it's around, well, the purpose, one of the purposes of the CEO is to work with a whole lot of people that are, and I think a lot of CEOs say this because people who get to the position where you and Teresa are generally humble around their effectiveness, but you hire people that are way more talented and smarter than you, and you just have to sort of make sure they push in the direction of their strengths and helped with their weaknesses. But actually, it's them that's running the business, and I'm just the conductor. But it is a bit of fit. It is about the team and getting high quality people, and I guess there's not a lack of quality of people that want to work in a business like Fisher & Paykel Healthcare.
No, I mean, if you think starting at 40 people and, currently 6,500 people, I've made a career out of hiring people that do things much better than I do.
It's obviously been a good skill set, because I refer you back to the share price increase that we've been talking about over the last 20 or 40 or whatever time period you want to think about. Lois, we've got a little bit more time to go, and then you have to get on with your day. But when I think about, there's so many things that you want to ask someone that you've got an hour to spend time with, and Fisher & Paykel is a business that I think is fascinating for the fact that it's such a global, high growth company. What do you think the future is for those sorts of businesses in New Zealand? And I know you're not a New Zealand business, and I really think that's important. I think I call it being a bit of a super Kiwi. You don't want to be too, we're a New Zealand business, and because I think you can get a bit too narrow-minded. But do you think, do you think we have the right setup in New Zealand to be able to foster more businesses that can turn into a Fisher & Paykel Healthcare over the next few years? And what needs to happen to really encourage that? Because you are quite lonely on the New Zealand share market, and in that sense, around high growth, high quality, high profitable growth businesses, and just interested to get your views on that.
Yes, they're very wide-ranging questions, aren't they? I think it is really important I can only talk to us really, but I think it's really important to think that we think of ourselves and you think of us as an international business. Nobody buys our products because they're made in New Zealand. That's not a selling feature. And nobody comes to work at Fisher & Paykel because it's a New Zealand company. That's not a selling feature for us. People buy our products because they think they're going to get the best outcome with it. And people come to work for us because they, I hope, they feel that's going to be the most satisfying job for them. So none of that's really connected to New Zealand. And it comes back to, where we were earlier in the process. New Zealand is different. It does have some unique things about it, and we have a long focus on making the most out of what's unique about New Zealand and mitigating what's a disadvantage to being in New Zealand. I can remember way back when I first started at Fisher and Paykel, somebody saying, hey, if we're dealing with a customer in New York, they should not be able to tell whether we're in California, New Zealand, or London. They should not be aware of our location. We should not penalise ourselves. So I think that's part of it. But and we've talked about New Zealand's got a nice. We've talked about the healthcare system and how that works for us. And that's probably the benefit of being a big fish in a small pond. So that can translate to, I would imagine, to other businesses. Being a big fish in a small pond, you've got some reliability, some confidence, some trust in the local community for what you're doing. Whereas, if we were located in California, we wouldn't have that.
What about availability of engineers and R&D credits and all that stuff? Is it the right setup?
Yeah. Well, when we look at, as far as R&D credits go, when we do look at location, and we do as custodians of the business, we necessarily need to do it dispassionately. You look at the place. There's a massive list of pros and cons, and we do it every time we look at manufacturing sites as well. There's a massive list, and R&D credits just goes in, oh, that's good, that's a tick. So I don't think there's any single thing. It's not many single things that would tip you, yes, this is the best place, or this is a place I won't go. There might be a few. But on the whole, it's the complete package, and that's where I put R&D credits. In terms of getting people, one thing did change for us a little bit. There are some skills we want you just can't get in New Zealand. It's only us. So that needs to be grow your own and to a certain extent import that skill. As we've become of a size, I think for quite a while, we had trouble getting people to move to New Zealand with the skill set. They would look at salaries, traffic, believe it or not, price of houses, and go, I don't want to move to New Zealand. So we had trouble getting people here when they just looked at it on the surface. And if they did come, they maybe come for the wrong reasons. We did get to a scale where people, that's not an issue for us now, but it's because in our kind of small niche, unique industry, we're at a scale where if you're in this industry, you probably know us, and you probably would see it as a great career move coming to work for Fisher & Paykel. So we're able to attract people to New Zealand if we want. But where I was heading to is when you look at the bigger picture, and not just in the last year or two, one of the challenges is getting the calibre, quality, and type of people that you want. And that is more and more becoming a global competition to get the calibre of the people you want. So we do fine recruiting in New Zealand as well, again, because we're a household name. We get, gee whiz, I don't know, but before COVID, for 100 positions, we would get over 1,000 graduates in New Zealand applying for those jobs. And so we do just fine. But if you look at the general economy, I don't think there's a surplus. Obviously, there's a little bit of swings and roundabouts on it. But on the whole, over the long term, I don't think there's a surplus of highly talented, highly skilled technical people, that's for sure, in the world. So I think one of the things we can do in New Zealand is make it a really attractive place to come and live and be. That's retention.
And that brings the talent, and it retains the talent.
Yeah, retention and attraction, yeah.
Well, Lewis, it's been really fascinating talking to you about you and your business, and it's really also refreshing not talking about quarterly earnings and marginal tax rates and depreciation lines and those sorts of things. So, look, we really appreciate your time. I could do this for another hour, but as you said, my complexity of questions were more because where do you even start with a career and a business journey like yours? But thank you for being so candid and open, and I've really enjoyed it.
Well, thanks. I enjoyed it too. A very different kind of interview, and an absolute pleasure, I'd have to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
This has been the Monday Call, brought to you by NZ Funds. New Zealand Funds Management Limited is the issuer of the NZ Funds KiwiSaver scheme, the NZ Funds Managed Superannuation Service, the NZ Funds Advised Portfolio Service, the NZ Funds Wealth Builder, and NZ Funds Income Generator. A product disclosure statement for each is available at nzfunds.co.nz. Past performance is not necessarily an indicator of future returns.